Paul Verhoeven's film Starship Troopers, 1997, portrays a futuristic society, the Federation, which at first glance appears to embody a democratic and meritocratic model. Citizens elect their leaders, a parliament exists, and the system is based on the principle that service guarantees citizenship. Only those who have voluntarily completed military service earn the right to vote and hold public office. This rule is presented as a fair and rational way to ensure that only individuals willing to defend society participate in its governance. Yet this democratic facade conceals more disturbing mechanisms that call into question the true nature of the regime. The omnipresent propaganda, media control, glorification of war and violence, ideological uniformity, and the visible absence of any real political opposition suggest a deeply authoritarian, even totalitarian, system. Verhoeven, in his ironic adaptation of Robert A. Heinlein's novel, multiplies visual and narrative clues, fascist-style aesthetics, martial slogans, infantilization of the population, to make us doubt, is this an authentic democracy, even an imperfect one, or a dictatorship that retains the external forms of democracy to better legitimize its power? The central question is therefore this: is the Federation's government a totalitarian regime disguised as a democracy, or does it retain enough democratic elements, elections, merit, voluntary participation, to avoid that label? This deliberate ambiguity is one of the film's greatest satirical achievements.
The Federation in the film Starship Troopers, film director Paul Verhoeven, released in the year 1997, presents itself as a meritocratic democracy in which full citizenship, the right to vote and hold public office, is obtained through voluntary military service. In the context of an interstellar war against the arachnids, this society appears to combine patriotism, equality of opportunity, and collective efficiency. Yet this appearance raises a central philosophical question. Can we still speak of a liberal or republican regime when political participation is conditional on armed commitment, propaganda is omnipresent, and the enemy is essentialized? Is the Federation a totalitarian system, that is, a regime in which the state seeks total domination of society, the absorption of the individual into the collective body, and the eradication of any autonomous private sphere, as analyzed by Hannah Arendt, Carl Friedrich, or Raymond Aron? The question forces us to confront the meritocratic ideal with the potential totalitarian reality between defensive efficiency and political alienation. The Federation appears to be a totalitarian system. Several classic features of totalitarianism: official ideology, de facto single-party, terror, control of the economy and private life, appear to be present. The ideology is omnipresent. State media, the film's satirical news bulletins, broadcast a Manichaean propaganda that turns the arachnids into an absolute existential threat, justifying total mobilization. Citizenship is no longer a natural right but a reward for sacrifice in the service of the collective. As in totalitarian regimes, the individual exists only through their usefulness to the whole. Non-citizens can live comfortably but are excluded from the political sphere. This is a form of civic apartheid reminiscent of the distinctions between party members and the masses in communist or fascist and Nazi systems. Social control is reinforced by a militaristic culture that permeates education, leisure, and romantic relationships. School, the army, and the media form a single apparatus of subjectivation. State violence is legitimized and even eroticized: recruitment scenes, corporal punishments. Finally, the economy appears directed toward the war effort, with little visible space for autonomous private initiative. The Federation thus achieves a total mobilization of society, characteristic of totalitarianism according to Ernst Junger and Carl Schmitt. But the Federation is maybe not as totalitarian as it appears. Several elements clearly distinguish this regime from historical totalitarianisms, Stalinism, Nazism. First, there is no single party or omniscient charismatic leader. The system remains formally republican. Citizens vote, and there appear to be debates within the military and political elite. Military service is voluntary. One can refuse and remain a prosperous civilian. This is not the total coercion of compulsory and permanent conscription found in dictatorships. Second, there is an absence of generalized terror against the domestic population. Repression seems limited to traitors or the incompetent in wartime, not to a permanent purge of class or racial enemies. There is no eschatological ideology, radiant future, superior race, but rather defensive pragmatism. The Federation does not claim to reshape human nature or abolish the family or private property. It maintains a consumer society and hedonistic individualism for civilians. Finally, Verhoeven himself emphasized the satirical nature of the film. The Federation is a liberal democracy pushed to the extreme by war, not a full totalitarianism. It retains a form of pluralism, differences of class, origin, gender, and a certain open meritocracy. Hannah Arendt distinguished totalitarianism by its ability to make individuals superfluous. Here, service instead makes the individual visible and recognized. It would therefore be more of a militarist authoritarianism or an illiberal democracy than a completed totalitarianism. A soft totalitarianism or an unprecedented hybrid regime may be identification options for this regime. The deeper dive reveals a hybrid regime that embodies a new form of domination adapted to the society of the spectacle and permanent war. On one hand, the Federation does not reach the total atomization and arbitrary terror described by Hannah Arendt. It needs motivated individuals, not interchangeable masses. On the other, it achieves an unprecedented capture of desire and identity by the state. Citizenship becomes the object of erotic and social desire. Propaganda is not only repressive but seductive, beautiful uniforms, glory, sexuality. It is a light or managerial totalitarianism that operates through incentives and spectacle rather than pure coercion, anticipating the societies of control described by philosopher Gilles Deleuze. Philosophically, it raises the problem of the conditions of possibility of democracy. Can a free public sphere be maintained when collective survival demands such mobilization? Plato in the Republic and Rousseau in the Social Contract accepted strong civic education and a certain austerity. The Federation is a technological and media version of this. But it also reveals the risk, highlighted by Tocqueville, of a soft despotism that leaves individuals free in their private sphere while controlling collective decisions. The Federation is not a classic 20th century totalitarianism, but it constitutes maybe a kind postmodern form of totalitarianism in which the state does not destroy freedom but makes it conditional on military merit and permanent staging. It questions our own era: how far can we subordinate universal rights to collective efficiency without sliding into servitude?
Is the Federation a totalitarian system, that is, a regime in which the state seeks total domination of society, the absorption of the individual into the collective body, and the eradication of any autonomous private sphere? As philosopher Hannah Arendt analyzes in The Origins of Totalitarianism, released in 1951, totalitarianism is characterized by the elimination of the private sphere and the transformation of individuals into superfluous beings, isolated and mobilized by an all-encompassing ideology. Hannah Arendt writes, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, the reality of experience and the distinction between true and false, the standards of thought, no longer exist." This thought underscores how totalitarianism destroys the capacity for independent judgment. Similarly, Carl Friedrich and Raymond Aron identified totalitarianism through key features such as an official ideology, a single mass party, a system of terror, and total control over the economy and society. Several classic features of totalitarianism appear to be present in Starship Troopers. The ideology is omnipresent. State media broadcast a Manichaean propaganda that turns the arachnids into an absolute existential threat, justifying total mobilization. Citizenship is no longer a natural right but a reward for sacrifice in the service of the collective. As in totalitarian regimes, the individual exists only through their usefulness to the whole. This total mobilization of society echoes Ernst Junger's concept of the total mobilization, developed in his 1930 essay of the same name. Junger argues that in the age of modern war, the genius of war was penetrated by the spirit of progress, leading to the complete integration of society into the war machine, where the distinction between civilian and combatant disappears. Carl Schmitt, in The Concept of the Political, released in 1932, reinforces this by defining the political through the friend-enemy distinction. The specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. In the Federation, the arachnids embody the absolute enemy, justifying the subordination of all social spheres to the state of exception. Social control is reinforced by a militaristic culture that permeates education, leisure, and romantic relationships. State violence is legitimized and even eroticized. The Federation thus achieves a total mobilization characteristic of totalitarianism. Nevertheless, it's difficult to be sure of this totalitarianism if we dive further into this thinking. Several elements clearly distinguish this regime from historical totalitarianisms: Stalinism, Nazism. First, there is no single party or omniscient charismatic leader. Military service is voluntary. This is not the total coercion of compulsory conscription. Second, there is an absence of generalized terror against the domestic population. There is no eschatological ideology but rather defensive pragmatism. The Federation does not claim to reshape human nature or abolish the family or private property. Hannah Arendt writes that true totalitarianism requires not just authoritarian control but the complete destruction of spontaneous social relations and the creation of a band of iron that fuses individuals into one movement. The Federation, by contrast, still allows a sphere of civilian hedonism and individual ambition, which prevents it from reaching the radical atomization Arendt describes. It would therefore be more accurately described as a militarist authoritarianism or an illiberal democracy than a completed totalitarianism. So, what shall we find to identify precisely this government? Our dialectic reveals a hybrid regime that embodies a new form of domination adapted to the society of the spectacle and permanent war. On one hand, the Federation does not reach the total atomization and arbitrary terror described by Arendt. It needs motivated individuals, not interchangeable masses. On the other, it achieves an unprecedented capture of desire and identity by the state through seductive propaganda. It is a light or managerial totalitarianism that operates through incentives and spectacle rather than pure coercion, anticipating the societies of control described by philosopher Gilles Deleuze. In his essay, Postscript on the Societies of Control, 1990, Deleuze writes, "We are entering into control societies that are defined not by confinement but by continuous modulation." Unquote. Unlike disciplinary societies described by Michel Foucault, control societies work through perpetual training, rewards, and floating modulation, precisely what the Federation achieves by turning citizenship into a desirable object of personal ambition and social status. This raises the problem of the conditions of possibility of democracy. Plato, in the Republic, especially books 2 to 4 and 8, accepts a strong civic education and a hierarchical meritocracy ruled by philosopher kings for the sake of justice and the common good, yet warns against degeneration into tyranny. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in The Social Contract, 1762, famously asserts that whoever refuses to obey the general shall be compelled to do so by the whole body, which means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. Rousseau accepts a strong civic bond and civil religion to maintain the Republic. Alexis de Tocqueville, in Democracy in America, 1835-1840, warns against the risk of a new soft despotism. It covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people.
The Federation as a totalitarian system is a thesis we can sustain again. Several classic features of totalitarianism, as rigorously defined by leading 20th-century theorists, are strikingly present in the Federation depicted in Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers. Carl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, in their seminal work Totalitarian Dictatorship and Autocracy, 1956, proposed a famous six-point syndrome to identify totalitarian regimes. These include 1. An official ideology, 2. A single mass party, 3. A system of terroristic police control, 4. A monopoly on the means of communication, 5. A monopoly on the means of armed combat, and 6. Central direction and control of the economy. The Federation fulfills most of these criteria to a significant degree. It possesses a clear official ideology, militaristic civic virtue fused with human supremacy, centered on the idea that only those willing to sacrifice for the collective deserve full political rights. There is a de facto monopoly on mass communication through the ubiquitous federal network news broadcasts, which function as pure propaganda tools, glorifying military victories while dehumanizing the arachnids. The state also maintains an obvious monopoly on legitimate armed force, and the entire economy is visibly oriented toward the war effort. Raymond Aron, in his major work Democracy and Totalitarianism, 1965, refined the concept by emphasizing 5 key characteristics: a one-party state, an official ideology with quasi-religious status, a monopoly of the means of coercion and persuasion, centralized economic direction, and ideological politicization of all aspects of life. Aron insisted that totalitarianism is not merely authoritarianism but a regime that seeks to remake society and human beings according to an all-embracing doctrine. In the Federation, although a formal multi-party system is never shown, political power is effectively held by a military-civic elite unified by the same ideology. Citizenship itself becomes the ideological cornerstone. Service guarantees citizenship is not a mere slogan but the sacred principle that organizes the entire social hierarchy. Every sphere of life, education, sexuality, leisure, and media, is politicized and subordinated to the war and the ideology of civic merit through sacrifice. The propaganda apparatus is particularly insidious. The satirical yet terrifying news segments, would you like to know more? Exemplify what Aaron called the monopoly of the means of persuasion. They create a permanent state of emergency and emotional mobilization, turning citizens into enthusiastic participants in their own subjection. The enemy is not simply a military opponent but an absolute existential threat. Bugs that are portrayed as mindless, collective, and irredeemably hostile. This leads us to Carl Schmitt's crucial contribution. In the concept of the political, Schmitt writes, the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. The enemy is, in the political sense, the other, the stranger, and it is sufficient for his nature that he is, in a specially intense way, existentially something different and alien. In the Federation, the arachnids perfectly embody Schmitt's absolute enemy, justifying the suspension of normal politics and the establishment of a permanent state of exception. Schmitt further argued in Political Theology, released in 1922, that sovereign is he who decides on the exception. The Federation's sovereign power, exercised by the military high command, constantly decides that the existential threat requires the subordination of all individual rights and private interests to the war machine. This connects directly to Ernst Junger's concept of total mobilization, 1930. Junger describes how modern technological war dissolves the distinction between civilian and soldier, front and rear, war and peace. The genius of war was penetrated by the spirit of progress. Total mobilization is far less consummated than it consummates itself. In war and peace, it is the expression of a secret and inexorable claim. The Federation exemplifies this. Society is entirely reorganized around the demands of interstellar war. Education is military preparation, entertainment glorifies combat, romantic relationships are framed through the lens of heroic service, and even science, biology, technology, serves destruction. Non-citizens may enjoy material comfort, but they are politically neutered, a form of civic apartheid that echoes the distinction in totalitarian regimes between the inner party, full citizens, and the passive population. Finally, violence is not only instrumental but aestheticized and eroticized. The recruitment ads, the corporal punishments, the fascination with powered armor. This creates the total character of the regime. The state does not merely rule, it seeks to shape souls and bodies in its image. Thus, when analyzed through the lenses of Friedrich, Aaron, Schmitt, and Junger, the Federation reveals itself as a highly sophisticated totalitarian system, even if it maintains a democratic facade. It achieves what these thinkers feared most: the complete absorption of the individual into the political collective under the justification of an existential threat.
Again, some elements induces a real doubt about a complete totalitarian state. Despite the disturbing totalitarian appearances, a closer analysis reveals that the Federation of Starship Troopers does not fully meet the criteria of classical totalitarianism. It is better understood as a harsh but limited militaristic republic, a regime that, while authoritarian in wartime, preserves crucial distinctions between public power and private life. In Leviathan, released in 1651, Thomas Hobbes argues that in the state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, dominated by a war of all against all. To escape this chaos, individuals enter a social contract and transfer their natural rights to a sovereign, the Leviathan, who guarantees peace and security. Crucially, Hobbes allows significant spheres of individual liberty, where the sovereign remains silent. As he states, the liberty of a subject lieth therefore only in those things, which in regulating their actions, the sovereign hath pretermitted. Leviathan, chapter 21. The sovereign's power is absolute in matters of security, but does not extend to total control over thought, belief, or daily life. The Federation closely resembles this Hobbesian model. Humanity faces an existential war against the arachnids, a literal state of nature on an interstellar scale. Full political rights, citizenship, are granted only to those who contribute to the common defense, mirroring Hobbes's idea that the sovereign may demand service for the preservation of the Commonwealth. However, service remains voluntary. Civilians retain wealth, property, careers, entertainment, and personal relationships without being forced into uniform. This preserves a substantial private sphere, exactly the liberty Hobbes protects when the sovereign does not explicitly command otherwise. Non-citizens are not liquidated or turned into slaves. They enjoy consumer abundance and personal freedom. The Federation thus functions as a protective Leviathan rather than a totalitarian machine that seeks to remake human nature itself. This Hobbesian logic is reinforced by the absence of several defining features of totalitarianism. Unlike Stalinist or Nazi regimes, there is no single ideological party that penetrates every institution, no cult of personality around an infallible leader, and no permanent purge or generalized terror directed at the domestic population. Repression appears limited to military discipline and cases of clear treason during active war. The ideology, service guarantees citizenship, is pragmatic and defensive rather than eschatological. It does not promise a radiant future or a new man, but merely survival and earned status. As Raymond Aron noted in Democracy and Totalitarianism, true totalitarianism requires an official doctrine that claims to explain and transform every aspect of existence. The Federation's doctrine remains instrumental, a means of survival, not a totalizing faith. Furthermore, the regime maintains key liberal institutions in muted form: private property, family structures, romantic freedom, and a consumer economy for civilians. These elements would be intolerable to genuine totalitarian regimes, which seek to abolish or subordinate all intermediate bodies between the individual and the state. Alexis de Tocqueville provides an additional illuminating contrast. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville famously warns of a new form of soft despotism that democratic societies risk, an immense tutelary power that covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, which does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. The Federation, however, is not this soft despotism. It does not infantilize its population through excessive administrative care. On the contrary, it demands courage, responsibility, and voluntary sacrifice from those who seek full civic status. It maintains a certain aristocratic ethos, merit through proven courage, within a formally democratic framework. Tocqueville himself admired aspects of militaristic and participatory republicanism as potential antidotes to democratic mediocrity. The Federation system, while severe, fosters a form of civic virtue and individual agency, however channeled through military service, rather than the passive equality of condition that Tocqueville feared would lead to democratic despotism. In short, the Federation is a militarist authoritarian republic born of necessity, not a completed totalitarian system in the sense of Arendt, Friedrich, or Aron. It demands much from its citizens, but leaves intact a Hobbesian sphere of liberty for civilians. It mobilizes society without entirely absorbing it. What appears as totalitarianism is largely the logic of survival in a universe that has reverted to a brutal state of war, a state of nature in the universe, a state under permanent existential threat, rather than a regime that has crossed the threshold into ideological total domination.
Actually, the regime in Starship Troopers is a kind of hybrid regime between Platonic Callipolis and postmodern power. The Federation is neither a classic 20th century totalitarian state nor a simple liberal democracy under strain. It constitutes a complex hybrid regime, a meritocratic militaristic republic that blends ancient hierarchical ideals with modern techniques of power and control. It achieves an unprecedented integration of the individual into the collective without resorting to the full terror and atomization characteristic of historical totalitarianism. This hybridity finds a powerful precedent in Plato's The Republic, particularly books 2 to 4 and 7 to 8, where Socrates describes the ideal city Callipolis. In Plato's Perfect City, justice consists in each class performing its proper function. The philosopher kings rule with wisdom, the auxiliaries, warrior class, defend the city with courage, and the producers provide material needs. Citizenship and political authority are not natural rights but outcomes of rigorous selection and education. The myth of the metals, the noble lie, justifies this hierarchy by claiming that citizens are born with gold, silver, or bronze souls, though exceptional individuals may rise or fall. Education is strictly controlled, poetry and music are censored to shape virtuous souls, and the guardian class lives communally, without private families or excessive wealth, so that their loyalty belongs entirely to the city. The Federation strikingly echoes this Platonic architecture. Full citizenship functions as a form of gold status earned through military service, akin to proving oneself worthy of the auxiliary or guardian class. The brutal training, discipline, and selection process in boot camp mirror Plato's rigorous paideia, designed to test and forge character. The slogan's service guarantees citizenship, operates like a technological noble lie. It legitimizes inequality of political rights while claiming openness to all who demonstrate merit. Like Plato's auxiliaries, federal soldiers are trained not only in combat but in a specific ethos, courage, loyalty, and sacrifice for the common good. Even the erotic dimension of the film, relationships framed by military glory, recalls Plato's controlled eros in the Republic, where desire is sublimated toward the beautiful and the good here, the good being the survival and greatness of the Federation. However, the Federation updates Plato for a technological age. It has media propaganda and powered armor. Yet the Federation exceeds the Platonic model through distinctly modern mechanisms of power. The philosopher Michel Foucault rejects the idea of power as merely repressive, the sovereign model of power as prohibition. Instead, he shows how disciplinary power produces useful, docile bodies through techniques of surveillance, training, and normalization. The Federation's military academies, with their constant evaluation, corporal punishment, and hierarchical observation, function as classic disciplinary institutions. Recruits are molded into efficient soldier citizens not primarily through fear of death, but through the production of skilled, obedient, and ambitious subjects. Foucault's later concept of biopower, introduced in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, 1976, adds another crucial layer. Biopower is the power to make live and to let die. It manages populations at the biological level through regulation, incentives, and optimization of life. The Federation subtly exercises biopower. It does not merely repress but incites and optimizes life. Citizenship becomes a reward that channels ambition, sexuality, and social status. The famous recruitment propaganda, "I'm doing my part," exemplifies what Foucault calls the productive nature of power. It does not say no, but rather yes, become this, desire this, identify with this. Power here operates through seduction and subjectivation rather than pure terror. Even more subtly, Foucault's notion of governmentality, developed in his Collège de France lectures, 1977 to 1979, describes the art of governing free subjects through their own freedom and interests. The Federation is a masterful example of neoliberal-tinged governmentality grafted onto a militaristic structure. Individuals are free to choose service or civilian life, yet the entire social field is structured so that ambition, desire for recognition, and erotic fulfillment are aligned with the interests of the state. One becomes a citizen by internalizing the regime's values and voluntarily enlisting. A perfect illustration of Foucault's idea that modern power works by constituting subjects who govern themselves in the name of their own freedom and self-interest. In societies of control, which extend Foucault's analysis, Deleuze underscores that power shifts from disciplinary enclosures to continuous, modulating control through rewards and perpetual competition. The Federation combines Platonic hierarchy and virtue with Foucauldian disciplinary and biopolitical techniques and Deleuzian modulation. It does not need total terror because it successfully produces desiring, ambitious subjects who willingly participate in their own governance. The Federation thus represents a postmodern Platonic republic, an updated Callipolis adapted to mass media, technological warfare, and advanced techniques of subjectivation. It avoids the radical evil of 20th century totalitarianism, the superfluousness of the individual described by Arendt, while achieving a deeper, more seductive integration of life into the political order. It forces us to confront a troubling philosophical question. In an age of existential threats, might the most effective regime be neither pure democracy nor classical totalitarianism, but a hybrid system that cleverly combines ancient meritocratic ideals with modern productive power?
To try to answer this question, let's dive into the concept of state and research for power. The comparison between the emergence and global spread of the modern state and that of the atomic bomb is more than a simple rhetorical metaphor. It reveals a profound dynamic of political technology, a governance innovation, the monopoly on legitimate violence, and a military innovation, nuclear weapons, that, once invented, proved so powerful and effective that they spread irresistibly across the planet, despite their existential risks. Both are adopted because they confer a decisive advantage in terms of security, power, and collective survival, while creating lasting ethical, strategic, and existential dilemmas. The modern state was born conceptually and institutionally with the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War. This system established territorial sovereignty. Each state exercises exclusive control over its territory and population, with no legitimate external interference, principle of non-intervention. Sovereignty as absolute and perpetual power was already theorized. Westphalia translated it into an international order. The German sociologist Max Weber defines the state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. This monopolization of violence allows humanity to escape the Hobbesian state of nature, described in Leviathan, 1651, as a war of all against all, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The state Leviathan from Thomas Hobbes is a necessary evil. It imposes order through centralized coercion in exchange for security. Like nuclear fission, this innovation is extraordinarily effective. It enables resource mobilization, taxation, standing armies, internal pacification, economic development, and power projection. States outcompete composite empires, city-states, and feudal structures. In the 19th and especially the 20th century, the model spread globally through decolonization, world wars, and normative diffusion, UN, international law. Today, virtually the entire planet is organized into nation-states, even if many are quasi-states, according to Robert Jackson. Let's dive into the analogy with the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb, used in 1945, represents a similar rupture in the military domain. Its destructive power is so immense that it radically transforms strategy. Total war between nuclear powers becomes virtually suicidal. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, illustrates this paradox. Possession provides ultimate deterrence and great power status, but widespread use equals apocalypse. Just as states prevailed over pre-modern political forms, nuclear, or aspiring nuclear, states gained security and influence. North Korea, Israel, India, and Pakistan all viewed nuclear weapons as a life insurance policy against hostile or stronger neighbors. No one wants to be without a Leviathan state or without deterrence in an anarchic environment. Proliferation is an important concept here. The global spread of the state followed a logic of mimetic and coercive diffusion, colonialism, decolonization, international norms. Similarly, nuclear proliferation is both horizontal, more states, and vertical. Despite the Non-Proliferation Treaty from 1968, around 10 states possess nuclear weapons, and others seek them. Effectiveness takes precedence over collective morality. Existential risk is now a permanent reality. The modern state, by monopolizing violence, can become totalitarian. Likewise, nuclear proliferation multiplies risks of accidents, escalation, or use by irrational actors. Both inventions create a balance of terror, short-term security paired with long-term civilizational vulnerability. Thomas Schelling and deterrence theorists emphasize that nuclear weapons stabilize relations between rational powers but make the system fragile. Similarly, the Westphalian system pacifies the interior of states while enabling total interstate wars, 1914 to 1945. 3. Philosophical and geopolitical dimensions. Thomas Hobbes justifies the Leviathan as an escape from the fear of violent death. The state is the mortal god. Analogously, the bomb becomes a nuclear Leviathan. It imposes an armed peace through mutual fear. As John Hers noted, nuclear weapons make borders permeable and render classical territorial sovereignty obsolete, loss of impermeability. Geopolitical realism is a good frame for an analysis. Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz, Neorealism, see international anarchy as a structure that compels states to maximize power. Nuclear weapons represent the ultimate expression of this logic. States proliferate just as nuclear power proliferates. Nobody truly wants to live outside the advantages of a modern state, and no state wants to be enslaved by others because it lacks nuclear power.
The modern state is a historical invention that has imposed itself and spread across the planet precisely because of its effectiveness. Emerging as a structured solution to anarchy, it demonstrated its superiority in organizing legitimate violence, mobilizing resources, and projecting power. This effectiveness explains its diffusion. Competing political forms, fragmented empires, city-states, tribes, have retreated in the face of it. In the same way, the atomic bomb is a weapon whose logic of proliferation is almost inevitable. Its exceptional destructive capacity makes it a decisive instrument for guaranteeing security and exercising deterrent power. States that acquire it significantly strengthen their international position. Consequently, nuclear proliferation appears as the technological counterpart to state proliferation. Two phenomena driven by the same rational pursuit of efficiency and survival in a competitive and potentially hostile environment. It is legitimate to draw an analogy between these two movements. Just as nuclear weapons spread despite non-proliferation regimes, because their strategic utility outweighs moral or legal prohibitions, the state model has established itself everywhere, including in cultural contexts far removed from its European cradle. States, like nuclear powers, multiply because they represent the most effective known form for ensuring collective and individual security in an anarchic world. Rejecting this analogy would mean ignoring the Darwinian logic of political and military systems. What works tends to spread. Thomas Hobbes had already laid the foundations of this analysis in Leviathan. In the state of nature, human life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The fear of violent death drives individuals to conclude a social contract that delegates the monopoly of violence to an absolute sovereign. Security is thus the primary raison of being of the state. Any political organization that better guarantees this security possesses a powerful adaptive advantage. In an uncertain world marked by geopolitical, technological, and ideological rivalries, the most effective systems for producing security and cohesion are destined to generalize. In Starship Troopers, The terrestrial society is a federal republic in which full citizenship, the right to vote and access to important positions, is granted only to those who have completed federal military service. The war against the arachnids justifies a permanent mobilization of society. This model combines patriotism, warrior meritocracy, and collective discipline. Given its potential effectiveness, strong social cohesion, elite selection through sacrifice, resilience in the face of existential threats, such a system could also spread. In a future where resources become scarce, where technological or ecological conflicts intensify, and where security remains the central concern, societies that best manage to mobilize their citizens will enjoy a competitive advantage. The proliferation of variants of this service for rights model is not improbable. It would follow the same logic that led to the triumph of the Westphalian state and the nuclear weapon. The philosopher Michel Foucault helps us understand that this type of organization does not necessarily appear totalitarian in the eyes of those who live within it. In his analyses of power, notably in Discipline and Punish and his lectures at the Collège de France, Foucault shows that modern societies exercise power not only through repression, but above all through subjectivation. They produce subjects who internalize norms and constraints. In Starship Troopers, military constraint is not experienced as external oppression, but as personal fulfillment and civic duty. Young people enlist with enthusiasm, propaganda is omnipresent but perceived as cool, and violence is aestheticized. Political rights are reserved for veterans, and this does not shock anyone. On the contrary, it seems fair and logical to most characters. This is precisely the mechanism Foucault describes. Power only functions effectively when it is internalized, when it shapes desires, identities, and consciousnesses. The film's soft or smiling totalitarianism is all the more powerful because it is desired by the very subjects it shapes. Thus, the satire of Starship Troopers, which might appear to us today as a liberticidal regression, conditioning fundamental rights on military service, could also in the future, in a context of real threat, represent maybe a superior form of collective emancipation and responsibility. Subjectivation renders the authoritarian dimension of the system invisible, or even attractive. Efficiency remains the ultimate criterion for the selection of political and military forms. The state has become widespread, nuclear weapons are proliferating, and more demanding organizational models, such as the one outlined in Starship Troopers, have significant potential for diffusion in a world that has become dangerous again. Hobbes reminds us that security comes first. The most effective forms of power are those that make us desire and create at the same time subjectivity while integrating the forms of power and make them appear natural and not to question. The future could likely belong to the systems that best combine two dimensions, producing security while manufacturing subjects who accept it or even demand it. Maybe not. Maybe Starship Troopers will remain a magnificent film and satire without any type of link with today or future reality. But maybe we will assist to a proliferation of this kind of regimes and governments for the same reason explaining proliferation of Westphalian states and proliferation of nuclear weapons, that is to say, effectiveness. It's potentially bankable. In a frame of general state of nature and perpetual danger of imminent violent death, everybody will want to be in a better secured state, all the more when liberty of choice is apparently still existing without too many inconvenience. But this kind of liberty, as in the movie, is perhaps just a theoretical one.